Hi, I'm Mark Cousins. I'm the writer, director, and cinematographer of the new film, The Storms of Jeremy Thomas. This is a film about a film producer, a great film producer, a radical film producer, a punkish film producer, an English film producer. We don't really hear about producers so much. We hear about directors, etc. But it's about time that we tried to get into the imagination of film production. It's not only about budgets and it's not only about contracts. It's actually about a kind of envisaging a kind of cinema, and Jeremy Thomas has envisaged a kind of cinema. He made Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, The Last Emperor, The Shout, Young Adam, Crash, Sexy Beast, Naked Lunch, Dangerous Method, 13 Assassins, The Hit, On and On, Eureka, Tale of Tales, Blade of the Immortal. I mean, what? That's a shelf on your list of DVDs and Blu-rays alone. I rewatched all Jeremy's films. This is my folder, and these are my notes on each film, my scribbles, and that's only some of them. So I rewatched all the films. It is when you're making a film about cinema, the first thing you need to do is just watch loads. So I watched them all, and then quite quickly I came up with a structure for the film. And I never really type on the computer. I always do this kind of thing. So this was my structure here: sex, politics, death, self, etc. It actually changed the ending slightly different from what it looks, but I always scribble the structure on a big piece of paper like this because it's my way of seeing it visually, and then I stick it on the wall and those shelves behind me, and therefore you can see the film as a linear thing, and you can see the chapters and the shape of the film. I've admired Jeremy since the 1980s, but he's never produced anything that I've made. I think that he's the samurai and I'm the apprentice kind of thing. But of course, I've learned from his cinema, and not only from the actual films themselves, but how daring the stance is, how non-mainstream, how countercultural, how much that his films insist in looking at the darker aspects of life and how much they try to innovate. And if there's one thing I've learned from Jeremy Thomas's films, it's the need to innovate, to try and find new forms for your cinema. When I start a new film, I always try to make a list of the obvious ways of doing it, and then I strike those off. And you think you're not doing the obvious way. So the obvious way to make a film about a producer who's worked with some of the greatest directors would be to interview those directors. So I didn't interview any of the directors. And because this is a road movie, it's Jeremy and me driving through France to go to the Cannes Film Festival. The obvious thing visually to do would be to use drone shots of the car or a second car tracking around the first car. And I'm personally sick of drone shots in films, and so I thought no drone shots. And I thought, what if I just have two cameras and it's just him and me in the car, stay in the car, get that intimacy. So that was a way of trying to make it not like a standard like TV documentary. And the third thing I wanted it to feel like was a kind of kaleidoscope of images and film clips. We talk about Jeremy's films, but also Powell and Pressburger and the great British films and the great Japanese films and silent movies. And it had to have the feel of the kind of all the images in your head. Robert Louis Stevenson had this lovely phrase, 1,000 colored pictures to the eye. And I wanted this film to feel like 1,000 colored pictures to the eye. Jeremy gave me total freedom. I'm lucky enough, I'm totally honored that he had admired some of my previous films. And so he knew that my approach would be different, shall we say, and unusual, and aiming for a kind of poetics in some way. I always think of documentary at its best as a kind of lyric prose. So it's prose, but there's something lyrical about it. So I think he knew he'd get some of that. And he just cleared the decks for me and gave me the time that I needed, and understood that it was going to be intimate, and we talked about everything. But sometimes I switched the camera off and just used a little sound recorder, and that made it more intimate as well after a few glasses of wine in the hotel rooms at night. The challenge when you're filming on your own, there was only me, and my producer was in Cannes, and so he helped once we got to Cannes, which is the destination of the film. But there's no sound recordist, for example. There's nobody doing backup of the footage each night. So it's just a lot of hard work when you're working on your own and carrying multiple cameras. And I think I had 3 tripods and 8 batteries and things. So that's, physically tiring. But it means that you can feel the movie evolving, and it overall, therefore, to work in this super minimal way. It's the way that the Iranians work in their films a lot. To work in a super minimal way means that you get closer, more intimate. And Jeremy could see everything I was doing. And so that side of things, the harder you work, the more rewarding the work in a film like this. Jeremy's produced 70 films or something like that. And because I couldn't include them all, I tried to focus on films that have either touched me very deeply or seemed to be about identity, or were films that he initiated. So for example, David Cronenberg's very controversial film Crash, Jeremy had been interested in that book for a long time. So it was obviously personal to him. I chose a Nick Roeg film, Eureka, to focus on. It's not Nick's best known film, but it's about a guy who finds his gold. He's searching for gold, and then he finds it. And what do you do with the rest of your life once you've found your gold? And it seemed to be a metaphor for Jeremy, because Jeremy produced The Last Emperor, which won 9 Oscars, and he was only in his 30s. So what do you do after that? And so that film seemed to be very relevant. And another Nick Roeg film, Bad Timing, which is very much about identity and the fragmented nature of identity and the erotic imagination, that seemed to be very relevant. Jeremy's films have often been about sex or sexuality, so that seemed relevant as well. A few years before we made this film, I'd been in Cannes and having lunch with Jeremy on the fancy balcony of the Carlton Hotel, and a storm came, and the diners grabbed their plates and ran. It was like, oh no, here comes the rain, here comes the storm. And Jeremy just looked around and said, isn't this wonderful? He likes storms, and he, I think, realizes that in some way our inner lives are stormy, and that film productions can be stormy too. So I thought that's the central metaphor in the film. Making Crash, making The Last Emperor, making Shout, making The Hit was like a storm. And then there are a few people in this film, the great Tilda Swinton's in it, and the great Deborah Winger, for example, are both in it. And both of them like this image of filmmaking as a kind of tempest, as a kind of storm. Jeremy has seen the film and he likes the film. I think he likes it a lot because he sees it's a kind of love letter to cinema, a kind of act of worship about the nature of cinema. So he likes that. Of course, none of us like looking at ourselves when we're older. And at one point in the film, Jeremy talks about the lines on his face, and none of us really enjoy looking at ourselves in that way. So it's always hard if you're the subject of a film. But I think the danger would have been to under-imagine Jeremy's cinema, under-imagine the thematic richness, the politics, the transgression of his cinema. But I think he feels that this film doesn't under-imagine it, and that's a big relief. Can you imagine how sweaty my palms were sending him the rough cut? Because it's so much, it's basically only him. So it's always a scary moment, but I was very pleased that he liked it. I wanted the film to have a feel of Cannes. I've been in, I think this year will be my 24th Cannes, and so I do have a feel of what Cannes is like, and the calmness of the morning and the chaos of the afternoon and the tumult of the evening. So I wanted to capture that. Of course, we wanted the film to be shown in Cannes, but you never know. And I was sort of saying, I don't think Cannes will take it. I don't think Cannes will take it. So when I heard from Cannes that it was in, the first person I called was Jeremy. And he said, "That is wonderful. That is wonderful." This film isn't about the sort of the techniques of film production, scheduling, budgeting, contracts. It's more about how to stay alive and stay alert and not get lost on when you're a film producer. I think it's not only about Jeremy Thomas. It's trying to say the film world is changing remarkably. It's become very corporate, and some organizations own many brands and franchises now. And it's trying to say, remember the counterculture. Remember that, as well as making our big mainstream films, which we all love and I go to see them all, remember that cinema needs an avant-garde. It needs to dig deep into humanity, and therefore the film is a kind of reminder to cherish the difficult films, the challenging films, because in a way, they're the most rewarding films. I think probably Bad Timing is the film that Jeremy has produced that I liked most. It was made in 1980. I saw it in 1983. I was 17. And before I knew really too much about love, before I knew too much about the valley of tears of life, the sadness as well as the mountaintop. Here was a film with such amplitude, such overwhelming sense of the tragedy of what love is. And so it really affected me as a very young man, just turning into an adult, and it has stayed with me. And I still think it's a work of incredible richness. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy this film about Jeremy Thomas. You might not have heard his name before you see this film, but hopefully afterwards you'll feel the intensity of the humanity and the love of cinema of this man.